All right, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's session on accessibility and policy, which will be presented by Dr. Caroline Stratton from Florida State University's School of Information. Thank you so much for joining us at InfoCon 2022. Dr. Caroline Stratton is an assistant professor in the School of Information at Florida State University. Her research addresses how organizations may effectively harness information technology in pursuit of social objectives. Her recent and ongoing work in information policy examines topics of broadband policy, freedom of information, and open government data. She holds a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and is a former nuclear engineer. Thank you so much for presenting with us today, Dr. Stratton, and I will let you take it away.
Super. Thank you so much, Amy, and glad to see folks are here. I'm just going to get my slides pulled up, and I am really excited to be here to address you and talk about the topic of accessibility in policy. And I also just want to preface this with a note about what I mean by accessibility first, because it turns out that accessibility is a term of art in the field of information studies and in disability studies as it relates to how people with a whole spectrum of disabilities are able to and have the right to access information in forms that work for them. I want to tell you that in general in this talk, I'm going to start by thinking about accessibility in an even broader sense, in a more the way we might use this word in everyday language rather than that term of art way in relating to disability. I'm just going to talk generally about how policy affects how we access information. And I will come back to, actually circle back to the accessibility as it relates to disability and what that has to do with policy. So thanks for bearing with me through that sort of intellectual differentiation to begin with. Like Amy said, I'm an assistant professor at the Florida State University School of Information, where I am lucky enough to teach a course about information policy. And so I want to start the session with just a broad general question that I'm going to give you some sort of more concrete examples about. But for scholars who study information policy, the sort of broad question that brings us together is that we might ask, how does policy shape access to information? How does it shape who has access to what information, under what circumstances, when, and where? What am I talking about? Can I make this concrete? Absolutely. So unless you have just been absolutely staying away from the news cycle about information and society, a topic that's really grown in interest in 2022 and even before has to do with children's access to information. That we know right now that across the country and even potentially abroad, that censorship or removal of materials, challenges to materials in school libraries and public libraries is impacting what information children are able to access. And for example, all of my slides will have a mishmash here of some screenshots, but the American Library Association, for example, tracks the reasons why patrons challenge books. And these challenges change over time. The concentrations of them change over time. But we know right now that schools policies, school districts policies, libraries policies, the policies of states and governments are all coming into conflict in libraries, in collections that children have access to, and ultimately affecting what may be available to them when they do something like walk into the public library or even walk into their own classrooms. To take it a little bit into the digital age, although, access to physical information is very much a relevant topic in 2022, we might think about what we have access to on social media. This is another sort of policy flashpoint right now, that we know we have states that are interested in saying, hey, social media companies, people should be able to write anything they want on social media, and that should be broadly accessible, that the content moderation that your content moderation policies ought to be different. So something like the Facebook community standards that states like Florida and Texas have attempted to influence and say they shouldn't be that way. And that this is also, hit the highest levels of our government, that we find that we've got authorities like the Supreme Court weighing in on the constitutionality of changing how access to information on social media happens, who can create what, and who will be able to see what. Also in this space, we've got sort of exciting new developments from Europe, from the European Union, in the form of the Digital Services Act, that again, might go and shape what kind of information we can have access to on social media, what we can create as well, and who it is distributed to. And yet another ripped from the headlines area, data privacy is an enduring topic of interest, both in the United States and abroad. That, for example, this summer, especially as other public policies have changed, especially in the US around abortion, that people have started wondering, well, what about the things that I'm producing on social media? Will those be private if law enforcement wants to seek them? How might they be used in other sorts of policy-related applications? Right now in the US, our Federal Trade Commission, which has kind of limited power to protect data privacy of who has access to information about us, that they're seeking to create new rules about commercial surveillance and the security of our data. And we also know that people are really interested in protecting children's data, protecting access to information about children based on the digital traces they're leaving online. There's been recent fines handed down to Meta, for example. Again, this is a space where states are interested in creating information policy, that California has taken a new step towards adding more protections for the data of minors. And my final of ripped from the headlines information policy, and a really emerging space right now, has to do with how governments might regulate algorithms or artificial intelligence. So through the Digital Services Act in the EU, or activity that's been taking place really recently in China, or what our United States government is going to do, that we might have increasing access into understanding how our information is being used and how it's being processed algorithmically and through AI. This is a very rapidly changing space, and one where we're going to see more governments start to approach this problem. But I want to stress that all of these policy problems, whether we're talking about what books should children have access to read in libraries, to how ought my insurance company be able to use information that it can glean about me to come up with, how much I pay for my car insurance, that policy shapes who can access information, how we can do it, where we can do it, when we can do it. We could add all of our question words here to say that policy has a ton to do with how we're able, with the conditions of access to information. And I also stress here that this policy might be abroad, that we know that European Union policy still, has a broad effect all over the world. It might be federal, that it's made at the level of our national government. It might be at the state level. It could be local. It could even be within individual organizations that your local library has developed a policy about how it's going to treat book challenges, for example. I also tell students often that in this field, if we're thinking about the field of information policy, we might be sometimes talking about laws or things that just have policy in the name. You might think about it like a privacy policy at your doctor's office even, but we're also thinking more expansively. This might be things like court decisions. They might be things like more informal rules or frameworks, or sets of things that essentially tell us who can access information and the other questions we could ask about the conditions of access. So this is a really broad answer to that sort of general question I posed, and I'm going to bring this back together again with more specific examples. So I teach an introductory course in information policy that I am always thrilled to introduce to students. And in the course, we explore a grab bag of information policy topics that we are everywhere from thinking about where, where telephone service was located, what this has to do with internet service, how this is manifesting in social problems around digital inequality, to things like the freedom of information and transparency in government. We think about things as broad as and advanced as things like smart cities technology and policy around that, to things like AI, algorithmic decision-making, but also more classic or more material or more longer standing concerns around things like the accessibility of information in relation to disability. How are people actually able to take in information in ways that works across, we might think about physical disabilities and cognitive disabilities, that's not simple in any way. And it turns out our policies about it are also quite complex. We think about censorship and intellectual freedom. We think about speech on the internet, of what kind of speech are we able to lawfully produce, and are others able to access. We think about privacy, secrecy, and security as they affect our access to information and others' access to our information. Take it in really different directions towards copyright, intellectual property. And so this looks like a really diverse list of topics. And I always stress to students that they may not love every single one of these. And I would say that most information policy researchers maybe have a couple of these that they really focus on and aren't necessarily interested in the whole spectrum of these things. But nevertheless, I always think that there's something within the course that any information professional could get excited about, or could say, oh yeah, this is an issue that I really care about, or the one that I want to take action on in my workplace or in my personal life as a citizen as well. So the thing uniting these topics, again, gets back to what are the conditions by which we can create, access information, copy it, work with it, transform it, do other things with it, of really exploring those conditions as they're laid out in policy, or as those conditions aren't very well established in policy and lead us to particular social problems. Policy research in information studies, the thing I love to stress here is that we don't just explore what is in the content of a policy, that our job is never simply to read a law or read the rules and stop there, that there's a whole social world around policy that can tell us things to advance our knowledge and also provide practical contributions. We can do things like determine how policy was made, when, why, who was it representing, what sorts of interests. We can relate policies to other policies. We can do comparative analysis. We can critique what policy does. We can monitor how well policies are performing to the goals that they have. We can evaluate outcomes. We can advocate for policy and influence it. We can also provide sort of a more neutral kind of research as an input for policymakers. It's also a thing that's really exciting about this field is that it admits all kinds of research. We can do research that's descriptive. That is, that we just say, hey, here's how the world is, here's how policy is, here's how it's functioning in society. We can also do prescriptive or normative research where we say, here's how things should be, that here's what would make our world a better place or resolve some of the social problems that we're getting from our current policies or our lack of policy. There is quantitative research to do about this, of things with numbers, counting, statistical inference, you name it, we can do it. There is qualitative research to be done here. There is close reading to be done. There's discourse analysis. There is a full spectrum of data collection and analysis methods, everything from human subjects research, where we're surveying people, interviewing people, observing them, to really unobtrusive stuff like working with secondary data or using digital traces of what people do on the internet to collect our data. And again, we can bring all manner of methods of analysis to data to say something, to advance knowledge about information policy, and to provide, practical solutions and ideas for people who really care about these policy issues and also have the power to make changes in them. So I want to tell you a little bit about ways I've sort of taken this toolkit recently, both in my topic selection and questions I've been posing. So these, I was thinking about 4 studies of things I've done recently or am working on. Some of this is already published, some of it's under review, some of it's freshly. I'm thinking about it right now. This is all in different sort of stages, but some of the work I've done recently. So I've done some recent work with a friend about the Freedom of Information Act and asking questions like, how do technologies, especially software, shape the process of asking for information when you're a member of the public? And how do they shape the experience of being a government official responding to a request for information? What does it mean if the requester and the government are only communicating with each other through a particular software platform? Excuse me. And how does that change what that process has looked like before digital technologies were deeply involved? In the space of open government data. So this is the case of governments posting data sets to their websites and saying, hey, here's things we've created. We think citizens can do something with it. With a student who is actually in this talk right now in our audience, we've been asking questions around, okay, now that data is out there on the internet and available to people, what data do people actually want to use? We know that there's a lot of open government data that goes unused entirely. And so can we learn something if we look at the data that people apparently do really want to do something with? That we might be able to better inform governments about how to prioritize their resources, or we might be able to better teach people how to go and start doing things with open government data. In the space of digital equity, I've done research recently into how local policies, so for example, city policies, how they intend to improve public access to digital information, what kinds of actions they prescribe, what kinds of funding they put forth, what they know about the problem, and how they think they're going to get to a state where more people in the local jurisdiction have better access to information. I've also done some work on internet infrastructure, where it's located and how we get new internet infrastructure. And I did this in collaboration with geographer colleagues, where we asked, what are these arrangements between private sector telecommunications companies and governments to build new internet infrastructure like, and what consequences do they have for the public because of where the infrastructure ultimately gets built? So these are some sort of more taking those general cases of how does policy shape access to information and narrowing it down into particular issue domains and specific sort of research questions and families of research questions we can ask about information policy. All right, so if you're thinking about applying to graduate school, you're thinking there's something on that list I'm really interested in, or there's something in those examples that I care really deeply about, or I've got some professional experience about this and I want to expand it. How do you explore this at graduate school? Well, one possibility is coursework. That some information school graduate programs offer coursework, required or not, in information policy, or it might also go under the moniker of technology policy or telecommunications policy. For example, I teach a course in information policy. I've told you about that. The information school that I did my graduate work at had some more specific courses, potentially around some issues in information policy, but didn't really have sort of a general survey course like the one that I get to teach now. Sometimes these courses are not even within iSchools, that it turns out there are people in a whole lot of other disciplines are also interested in these issues. So I'd recommend checking out course catalogs specifically to see what's available there. Are there special topics courses? I'd recommend attending research talks and events about these policy topics that schools that are going to have active information policy faculty and research programs will hold these things to talk about, where people might be talking about new findings or bringing together scholars and members of the public to talk and think together about specific topics. And gaining research experience in graduate school by working on research with faculty on these topics is, again, a really great way to explore this interest, flesh it out a little bit, and build up some skills as well in this area. I also want to stress something that's a little strange about policy in information schools is that you might find resources about specific issues. And I've got a few listed here, like intellectual freedom in libraries or health data privacy or AI regulation. That scholars are more likely to describe some of their research or their research interests in these specific ways, rather than saying, oh, I'm a researcher of information policy. It might be, I do work in the space of digital equity policy or open government data, for example, or smart cities policy. Those are the kinds of keywords that might clue you into, oh yeah, this is information policy research. That's just something to think about as you are thinking, you know, where fits best for me, or where is most likely to have resources to further my interests. All right, so what do you do with this interest? Where do you take this into a career path? One thing that's so exciting about this to me is that I think there are a lot of ways you can take this. It's just a matter of thinking creatively about who could really use this expertise. So clearly, governments make these kinds of policies that positions to perform policy research and advise policymakers. That's a really clear way to use this expertise. One thing we know right now in the US government, especially at the federal level, is that there is a dearth of specific knowledge about technology. Digital technologies are not typically our policymakers' strong points. And so getting more people with fresher experience and education into our policymakers' offices to work with them so that they're able to really be well informed about the state of current technological issues in society is really important right now. There's also government positions to administer policy programs. An exciting opportunity that I love to see more people who've been through iSchools in is that especially our big cities in the United States are more and more have digital inclusion programs or digital equity programs, have open government data programs, have innovation offices where we're exactly the kinds of people with precisely the kinds of knowledge to really step in and make those run effectively and think creatively about them. There's opportunities to take this kind of expertise to the private sector to work on policy teams and policy projects. The tech industry seems to be a place where we could be, again, really good sort of translators or bridgers that information professionals, we're not necessarily legal professionals. Some of us are, which is really neat. I myself am not, but being able to sit in between legal professionals and technologists and understand both sides and be able to translate between the sides is a really valuable skill set. And again, one that I think information professionals are so well poised to do. There's work within civil society. So the issues that I've mentioned, whether we're thinking about censorship or digital privacy or algorithmic fairness, that there are all sorts of civil society groups like nonprofit groups, community-based organizations that advocate for particular groups of people for policy to be made in certain ways. Some of these groups also provide services to the community. This is especially true if we're thinking about issues like around digital inclusion, that there are great opportunities for us to step in and try to shape policy, or again, provide policy programs to the public. There's also, whether we're thinking about traditional institutions where information professionals work, and here I'm using LAM, libraries, archives, and museums to stand for that, management roles in libraries, archives, and museums, but also far beyond those kinds of organizations. We know that managers are often tasked with developing and implementing organizational policy. And again, these are great roles to bring a background in information policy into. And finally, something I want to stress before I pause is that policy entrepreneurship, which is this practice essentially of advocating for policy from outside of a policy-making position, is an option for all of us. So what am I talking about here? Here, I mean something like, I'm most definitely not employed in the federal government, but when the FTC says, hey, we're looking for public and expert comment about commercial surveillance, that doing something like responding to that and offering my particular input based in research is something that I can do. That activities like writing a policy brief about broadband infrastructure and adoption, and working with think tanks, for example, or nonprofits to think about who should I get this to, that there are other ways to work in the policy space, even if we're not elected officials, or even if we're not government staffers, that the kinds of knowledge that we gain in information policy training and the kinds of skills we get make us really powerful from wherever we're situated to take on policy entrepreneurship. So I just want to stress that this field is diverse, it's exciting. There's a lot of places where you could bring an information policy background and thinking about how information is made accessible to people, whether we're talking about the narrow term of art, accessibility, as it relates to disability, or we're thinking more broadly about all other kinds of access to information. And with that, I'm going to pause right here to see what kinds of questions we have, and to also thank you for your time and offer you my email address should you want to keep talking about this, and also to give a shout out to Shezin Hussein, who's in the room and is working with me on some of this really exciting policy research too. So Amy, I think I might be turning it back over to you.